Hello everyone. In this lesson we're going to learn how to let one user follow another user. And more specifically, we're going to talk about how would we store that relationship in the database. Let's jump into the action. So once you log in and then you click to visit your profile, this screen would show you, how many people are following you and then how many people you are following. And then if you clicked on one of these links, it would show you a list of the appropriate users. Cool, but the question is, how should we store that relationship that one user follows another user? How should we store that in our database? Well, I think we should just have an additional table. So we have a post table, we have a users table. I think we should have a brand new table called follows. And in that table, there can be one column that stores, the user that's doing the following. And then there can be another column that stores the user ID for the user that's being followed. And the idea is that each row in that new table, represents one relationship, one follow. As long as we have those two different ID numbers, we can power the entire website, right? We can use those IDs to build out your homepage feed, posts from the people you follow, and we can use those IDs and that relationships to populate these two screens as well. So right now, let's go ahead and set up that new table in our database. So to do that, you would just go into your command line. So let me open up a new command line. And you would run this command, right? PHP artisan make:/migration, and then let's give it a name of create_follows_table. Go ahead and press enter. Laravel is going to automatically create a new file for us in database and then in migrations. Here's our brand new file. So it's a timestamp and then it ends with create follows table. So here's what I would do inside this file. We're looking for the up function. So Laravel already spelled out, the name of the table, these basic columns. Maybe right below this first ID column, let's add a new column. So $table, look inside it, and let's call foreign ID parentheses semicolon, and let's name it, user_ID. So the idea is that this would be storing the user that's doing the following. So the user that's following a different user. This is the person creating the follow. Right, so just like a blog post has a column of user ID, whoever's creating this follow, it makes sense it would have a column of user ID. Let's go ahead and add on, call the method of constrained. Oops, helps if you spell it correctly. Cool, so MySQL won't even let a row be created if this is not a valid user ID in the users row, the users table. Cool, but now we would also want to store the ID of the user that's being followed. Now this is where things get a little bit confusing because remember, when you're using this foreign ID method, the name that you choose here sort of matters. In this case, because the naming convention could get very confusing really quickly, I want to show you how we can take matters into our own hands, and I want to show you what this foreign ID method is doing for you. So essentially, this is performing two different steps for us. But let me show you how to do those steps or perform those steps on your own. So let's say $table, and let's call a method of unsigned big integer, semicolon, and we can give it any name we want. Why don't we call it followed user, right? The user that's being followed. I'm just making up this name. Okay, and then that's just creating a column in the table. Now let's create the actual foreign key. So table, look inside it, call foreign. We're not calling foreign ID, we're just calling a method of foreign. Semicolon, let's give it a name, followed user. And now let me make sense of this. So when you use this method that Laravel offers of foreign ID, that's creating both the column and the key for you. And so this field name that you choose here, this matters, right? It's going to know to build the key in such a way where this is the table that you're referencing and this is the column that you're referencing. In this case, we're creating the column ourselves, we're creating the key by ourselves, so we need to tell MySQL, which table does this key reference and which column does it reference. So what we would do is at the end of this line, we would call the method of references, and that would be the column name. And then at the end of that, tack on a method of on, and that would be the table name. Cool. So in these two lines of code, there doesn't need to be anything magical. We're not following any conventions about the name we're choosing here. We're just manually spelling out, the table and the column that this key is referencing. Cool. Let me remove this empty line. Let's go ahead and remove this empty line. Let's go ahead and save this. And now to actually run this migration, you would just, in your command line, say PHP artisan migrate. Push enter. If you go refresh with this icon in SQL Workbench, cool, we now have a follows table, and if you view it, beautiful. So each row will have its own ID, but then this column keeps track of the person doing the following. This column keeps track of the person that's being followed. Cool. If you wanted to, you could click on this icon for the follows table. Down at the very bottom, you'll see there's a tab. It's falling off the bottom of my screen, but there's a tab called Foreign Keys. If you click on that, cool. So this is the one that Laravel created for us when we used the foreign ID method. So it's referencing the users table. This is the one that we spelled out or created ourselves. Perfect. It's also referencing the users table. And you can see that both of them, for their referenced column, perfect. It's the ID column on the user table. Beautiful. Okay, at this point, now that we have the shape of this database table set up, now let's go back to our website. And, I'm logged in with the Brad user, but if I visit, the profile of Barks a lot, oops, it helps if you spell it correctly. Let's set things up so that I can actually click on this icon to follow that user. To do that, let's actually begin by jumping into our routes file and setting up a route for creating and removing a follow. So here's what I would do. Jump into your web.php file, and let's create a new comment. We can say, follow related routes, and let's set up one route for when you send a post request, semicolon, and the URL pattern would be, quotes. Let's just make up a name of slash, maybe create-follow, slash, and then the dynamic part, this would be the person's username that you're trying to follow, right? Like Brad or Barks a lot. Only in curly brackets, we can spell out sort of a variable name. Now remember, you can use any variable name you want. So we've seen examples where we say pizza, but let's say user because that would make sense, right? This is the username or the user you're trying to follow. And now let's remember that by default, Laravel is going to look up a record by its ID. If you want to look it up by something else, you can just say colon and then, the name of the column that you want to look it up by. So let's actually look up the user by their username. Cool. Now, instead of the B placeholder, let's just point towards a follow controller. We haven't even created a controller called follow controller yet, but we can create that in 10 seconds from now. But let's say, follow controller, colon, class, comma, and let's make up a method name of maybe, create follow. Cool. Let's duplicate this line, and this on the copy, it can be remove follow. So if you want to unfollow someone, and then for the method name, instead of create follow, this could be called, delete follow. Or just to be consistent, you could say remove follow because that's what we named the URL. But it doesn't matter. We're just making up names. Cool. Now, before we save this file, let's go actually create a follow controller. So in your command line, you can just say PHP artisan make controller, and I'm going to give it a name of, uppercase follow, uppercase controller, but squished together one word. So just press enter. Cool. So now in our routes file, you can go ahead and right click on follow controller, click import class. Oh, we see an error message. The class is not found. Aha. It helps if you spell controller correctly here in your routes file. So I only had one L, but obviously in the command line, I spelled it correctly and I had two L's. So let me fix that typo now. If I right click on follow controller and click import class, beautiful. So now we can truly save this file. And let's jump into our brand new follow controller. So in our controllers folder, follow controller. Here in the class, let's create two functions. So public function, one of them will be named create follow, parentheses, curly brackets. Right below that, let's have public function remove follow, parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, now in order to create a follow in this function or delete a follow in this function, we know that we're going to need a follow model. So let's go create that new model right now. So in the command line, it would be PHP artisan make :model, and we would just name it uppercase follow. Let's go ahead and press enter. Okay, and then in our app models folder, Laravel just created this file for us. We actually don't even need to go into that file right now. We will a bit later on, but for now we can focus on our controller. Let's start with the create follow function. Let's actually write a few comments to remind ourselves of a few rules that we'll want to enforce, like you cannot follow yourself, and you cannot follow someone you're already following. So we can address those rules a bit later on, but for now, let's actually just try to create the follow. So here's what we would do. In these parentheses, we would use type hinting. So we would fill in the metaphor of what a user is with the incoming user variable from the router. In order for this to work, we want to right click on uppercase user and import that class. And we want the one that's in app models user. Cool. Down here, this is where we would actually create a new follow row in our database. So let's do this. Let's create a variable. We can name it anything, $, and just make up a name, maybe new follow equals a new instance of the follow model class. Now, you can right click on uppercase follow, click import. Cool. Semicolon at the end of this line. And now let's just fill in the appropriate values. So for example, our new follow, look inside it for user ID, and that would equal, and then just call the auth function, call the user function, and then look for its ID property. So whatever user is currently logged in, that's who's creating the follow. And then semicolon, let's say, new follow, look inside it for followed ID. That's the person that's getting followed. So that would equal, and then that's coming from the URL. So we could just say, $user, look inside that for ID. Semicolon, and then finally we would just say, this new follow, this instance of our follow model, just call the save method, semicolon. Cool, so this is an alternate way to create a record in the database. Previously, we've done it like this. We would say, uppercase follow, the static method of create. And then that's when you give it an array. And if you were going to use this strategy, that's when you would need to go into the model and say that certain properties can be mass assignable. But we're not giving it just an array. We're actually spelling out each value individually. So we don't need to worry about that mass assignment feature. Cool, let's go ahead and save this. And before we test it out, let's not forget, let's go back into our routes file and let's make both of these new routes protected by middleware. So you must be logged in to use them. So I would just borrow this code, right, where you call middleware must be logged in, just paste that here and paste that here. Cool. Let's give this a save and test it out. So in this window, I'm logged in as Brad. I'm viewing the Barks-a-Lot profile. And now all we would need to do is make sure that this button lives in a form that's posting to the correct URL. So we would just jump into our file that's named profilepost.blade.php. And up around line number 5, we see the opening form tag. Cool. So inside the tag, inside the element, let's give it a CSRF token. And then most importantly, for the action URL, instead of hashtag, let's set it to /create follow / and then it would just be double curly brackets, $username. So create follow Brad or create follow Barks-a-Lot. Let's give that a save and then be sure to refresh. And now this button's using that updated URL. So if I try to follow Barks-a-Lot, oops, 404 not found. I must have had a typo in my web router file. So if you go back into web.php, yep, you can see, I didn't have my second coffee today. So again, I misspelled the word follow for both of these routes. So 2 L's in follow, 2 L's in follow. If I save that, let me go back and re-click the follow button. Whoops, looks like I got another error from not having my second coffee. So I don't think I'm supposed to have a property or column named followed ID. I named it followed user. So I would imagine maybe I just mistyped something in my follow controller. Yes. So right here when we were assigning, the user that's being followed, that was my mistake. It's not followed ID. Remember in our database, we named that column followed user. Cool, let's save that. If anything, this is good practice, of making sense of the error screens in Laravel. But Go back and refresh, click the follow button. Cool, now we forgot to return a string of text or a blade template. However, if we go into our database and refresh the view for the follows table, beautiful. So the person doing the following is the Brad user, right? They have an ID of 1. The person getting followed is Barksalot, who has an ID of 2. At this point, let's go back to those comments that we wrote to ourselves and let's add these rules. So for the you cannot follow yourself, I would just say if parentheses curly brackets. For the condition, it would just be if the user that you're trying to follow, so look inside that for ID, if that double equals, and then just call auth, called user, look for ID. So essentially, if it matches your own ID, you can't do that. You can't follow yourself, so just return, call back, give it a message with of failure, and the message can be you cannot follow yourself. Cool. Now let's fill in the rule for, you can't follow someone that you're already following. For that, I would make up a variable name. Let's call it exist check. You can literally name it anything. I'm just making this up. But set that to equal. We're going to use the follow class and use its static method of where. In these parentheses, we'll spell out a query, but then after that, we're going to tack on a method call of count. So essentially, if we find a post we're looking for, the count will be greater than 0. If we don't, it's going to be 0. So that will be perfect for a true-false, Boolean statement. So in these parentheses, let's give it an array. In that array, we're actually going to have 2 subarrays. So, square brackets, comma, square brackets. And what we're going to do is we're just saying, let's see if there's already a row where both the user ID and the followed user values match what we're expecting. Right, so in other words, you can't follow the same user more than once. So in this first subarray, it would be, user ID, comma, and then the comparison operator would be just quotes equals, comma, and then it would be the logged in user. So call the auth function, look inside that, call the user function, look inside that for the ID property. So if user ID equals the user you're logged in with, and so in this subarray, it would be quotes if followed user, comma, the comparison is equals. If that equals, $user, look inside it for ID. Cool. So in other words, if we find this in the database, the count is going to be, 1. It won't be 0. Below this, now we can just say if parentheses, curly brackets, if, $exist check. If that evaluates to true, well, you can't do that, right? We wouldn't want this to go forward. So we could just say return back, call the with method, and failure, comma, you are already following that user. Okay, and then finally, if none of these problems exist and you actually do create the record, then down here you could just call the back function with and give it a message of success, user successfully followed. Whoops, and before we save, at the start of that line, you would want to return. So be sure to add the word return here. Cool, let's save that and test it out. So in this window, I'm already following the Barksalot user. So if I try to follow them again, beautiful, it doesn't let me. You're already following that user. Let's test if I try to follow myself. So if I inspect the follow button, and then in my dev tools, if I change the action URL for the form when it gets submitted to, my own username, and now I click the button, beautiful, you cannot follow yourself. Let's successfully create a follow. So in other words, in this window, I'm logged in as Barksalot. I'm viewing the Brad profile. If I click follow, beautiful, we see the success message, user successfully followed. And if you go into your database and refresh the view for follows, beautiful, we see a second row where Barksalot is following Brad. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we'll actually handle, showing the stop following button and also actually filling in these screens with content so you can see a list of the relevant users. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I'll see you then.